Hi everybody. My name is Michael, and I'm an Enterprise Customer Success Manager with Jotform. Thank you all for joining me in another installment of our Lunch and Learn series. Today, we'll conclude our discussion on conditional logic by exploring a few advanced uses of conditions. This session will build on our discussion from June 26, during which we reviewed some of the fundamentals needed to take advantage of these more advanced uses. If you haven't done so already, I'd recommend checking out that session on our YouTube channel or our Lunch and Learn page and combine the information covered then with what we review today. Before we dive in, I wanted to let you know that the enterprise server we are working in is not HIPAA enabled. While conditional logic can absolutely be used with a HIPAA compliant server, there may be some additional processes and setup involved in order to fully take advantage of this feature. If you have any specific questions regarding HIPAA compliance, please contact our support team for further assistance. And as per usual, we're going to be covering a lot in this video, so it will be recorded and we'll reserve some time towards the end of the presentation for questions. So as I mentioned earlier, today we'll be taking a look at conditional logic again, but we're going to take a look at some more advanced implementations of some of this logic. So we'll be discussing the getForm page URL widget and how it can be combined with the show hide field condition and URL parameters to create multi-step forms. We'll also explore setting up calculation values with certain fields such as dropdowns, single choice, or multiple choice, and then use those values within various conditions. And finally, we'll get into the use of input tables and how data can be extracted from those tables into individual fields to either use in conditions or just track within their own table columns. So let's get started by taking a look at the getForm page URL widget. So if you're not familiar with this widget, what it does is it gives the form access to the URL being used to complete it. And it'll actually collect that as submission data. So because it's being collected, you can go ahead and set conditional logic around that widget. So the form I've set up here just allows somebody to go ahead and create a request for inventory purchase. So the initial part of the form is actually visible to everybody. Then there's two hidden sections, one for the first approver and one for the second or final approver. These are hidden to the initial submitter, but they'll be used in our approval flow, which we'll take a look at in just a second. I also have some logic set up around this is an additional approval needed field because it might not necessarily need a second approver. So in that case, it'll just be one approver. But if there is a second approver, we have some logic set up to allow them to add who that second approver will be. And if we take a look at the conditions that I've set up here, so again, because we're now tracking the URL of the form, we can go ahead and set conditions around that get URL widget. So if I filter to that, and we'll just take a look at this first approval one. So the way that you set up logic with the get page URL widget is you're going to select the widget, and then the state is going to be contained. So you're capturing the entire URL. So you'll just want to make sure that you're only looking for a piece of that URL. And in this case, the value I'm looking for is this phrase first approval. So this value that can be set to anything you want. It doesn't have to be first approval like I have here. You just want to make sure that the value you put here is also used within your custom edit link and your custom URL parameter, all of which I'll show you in just a second when we look at the approval flow. And then the action here is I'm showing a couple of fields if this first approval phrasing is found in the URL. I've also set up fields for the final approval, where I'm showing some of the first approval fields and then some of the final approval fields. And then I actually have some disable conditions set up around this widget as well. So if it's the first or final approval, I'm going to disable all of the fields completed by the initial submitter so they can't change that original data, but they can see it. And then I just have a couple of more disable conditions set up around the two, phrasing. And if we take a look at the actual approval flow, so the first approval is where the first edit link is going to be used. So in the email here, I'm using the basic table and buttons that are provided with the standard email, but I've also added this phrasing with an edit link. So the way that you create a custom edit link is it's going to be the base of your server URL. So mine is going to be marketing.jotform.com, and then /edit like this, and then /the submission ID. And to make the submission ID dynamic, you can do ID wrapped in curly braces like I have here. And this will allow the submission ID from every submission to be passed through this email chain So that way it's dynamic for each submission. And then if you aren't familiar with URL parameters, to add them, you can add a question mark to the end of your URL. And then this is where that first approval phrasing that I used in the conditional logic is going to be used. So this is what's going to separate this edit link from the one for the second approver, which we can see here. Pretty much the exact same setup, except I'm using final approval instead of first approval as my custom parameter. I also have some conditional logic in this workflow. So if the second approver is needed, it'll go to the second approver. If it's not, then it'll just either send the email here or they could deny altogether and never have to worry about that approval. So here's how the form would look to the initial submitter. You'll notice because I don't have any of that phrasing in the URL, it's just the basic version of the form with all of the visible fields that I've intentionally left visible. So what would happen is somebody would submit this form, and then an email would go to that first approver. So they get all of the information from the form, including the get page URL, which you don't need to leave in the email. I just left it for this example. But you can see that it is captured as actually part of the submission data. And then they would get their edit link. So they could open that edit link, and they see all of the questions filled out by the initial submitter. And then they also have their section for the first approval, where they could add their information. And then I have some logic set up to the signature field to only show this question after they sign. And then if the second approval is needed, I could hit yes, choose who my approver is. I also have some logic just changing this email address so it doesn't have to be hard typed. And then I could actually submit this and make an edit to the form. What would need to happen then is I return to the email and click approve to move it on to the next step in the workflow, which would then trigger the email to the second approval, assuming they selected that a second approver is needed. So here they get the same email, except now I also get the information from the signer from the first approval. And then through the use of the edit link, I could open that up. Now I have final approval here instead of first approval. So I see all of the fields for the first approval, but they are also disabled, so I can't change them. And then I have my final approval information that I could fill out and add, and then return to my email and either approve or deny. But it allowed that step to be, or that form to be completed in multiple sessions, all with a single submission. So that can also be done without the use of an approval flow. So this form just allows a client to, or a contractor to collect some information from a client, fill out a form about it, and then provide some information about themselves and the project. So the project information and the signature for the client is all initially hidden. And that's because I have some logic set in to say, is the client on site? So if they select yes here, then all of these fields will just show, and we won't actually need our edit link because it's just going to be done in one session. But if they select no, the client isn't on site, that's where an email will get sent out with an edit link, kind of like we saw in the approval flow, where the client can then complete their portion of the form, submit it, and sign it, and all that good stuff. So if we take a look at the emails that are set up, before I get into the conditions, I have two different emails that I'm using. I'm using the autoresponder email and the notification email, both of which have conditional logic. And I talked about conditionally sending emails in the first session, so definitely feel free to take a look at that. There's some good info on when conditions should and how they can be used with emails. The one that has the edit link is going to be this autoresponder email. So the way I've set it up is that if the client is off-site, this email will send, but only if they're off-site, because it wouldn't be necessary if it's all done in one session. And here we have our edit link. Just like on the approval flows, the same format. It's going to be the server URL, the submission ID, and then I'm adding my custom parameter of client completion. So this is what I'm going to use in my conditional logic. I also have the notification email set up to conditionally send once both parties have signed. So once the client and the contractor have both signed, this email will send, and it includes a PDF attachment of the submission. I'm only sending this conditionally because the thank you page that shows by default actually has this downloadable PDF. So if they complete this all in one session, then this is the thank you page they'll see, and they can just do their download. There's no need for the emails. However, if the emails are needed, we'll show a custom thank you page that doesn't have the download because it's not completed at the time of the initial submission. And then around the get page URL widget, this is where we have our logic set up. So I'm going to show the fields that apply to all of the project information and the client signature. And then one thing to note is I'm also hiding the contractor signature and date. And I'm pointing this out because there's a setting we'll take a look at in just a second that's kind of important in this case. But I'm doing this because the client doesn't need to see the signature and date of the contractor. So just to kind of consolidate the form a bit. And then I also have my conditional logic set up for the email. Again, that first session has kind of all the details of like how this is set up and why I've set it up this way. So if we look at the form settings, what I wanted to point out is if you hit show more options here and scroll down a bit, you'll see this clear hidden field values option. So this by default is set to clear when submitted. So what this does is it says choose whether or not to clear values for fields hidden by conditional logic. So since I'm using conditional logic to hide that contractor signature and contractor date, I want to make sure I set this to don't clear so we don't lose that when the edit is made, where the client signs and fills out their portion of the form. So if we take a look at the form itself, you'll see on the initial fill out of the form, I can choose if the client is on site or not. If it's no, then none of that information shows. If I show yes, then I'll just show the project information and all of the signature fields. But let's say it was submitted with this being selected to no. That would trigger an email that would go to the client who needs to complete the rest of the form, and they can use this edit link. And when they open that up, you'll notice it now has that client completion parameter attached to it. So I could see all of those fields that were initially hidden, and I can't change any of these values because I'm using that disable condition as well. So that way the information initially provided is protected, even though it is visible in case it needs to be referenced. Then I could go ahead and complete my section about the project, and I can do my own signature. And then once I submit, it'll send that final version of the email to both parties, letting them know that the document is, or the form is completely signed. And it'll have that PDF attachment that has all of the submission details in it. All right, and moving on from the get form page URL widget over to calculation values. So you'll recall in the last session, I showed a quiz and I mentioned that I was using calculation values to score the quiz, but I didn't really get into the calculation values at the time. I was more so focused on the conditional logic of the quiz itself. But if we take a look at the calculation values and what they do, so they essentially allow you to set an underlying value or like a behind the scenes value of text that you display in like a drop down or single choice or multiple choice field. And you could turn those on by going into the properties and going to options. And if I turn on my calculation values here, I can actually set the scoring values or the behind the scenes values of these to, a numeric or text-based value. I have examples for both. This one's numeric, obviously, because it's a quiz and I'm using it for scoring. But you'll see here that I had just set 0 for the wrong answers and 1 for the correct answers. And then another change that I made on this form is that instead of using conditional logic to do my calculations, I'm actually doing them with the form calculation widget. So this allows me to reduce the total number of conditions needed on the form and also just helps kind of clean everything up a little bit because I don't have to go and edit a bunch of conditions if I say want to add another question. I just simply need to add that question to this form calculation and go on about my day. And because I set the calculation values of 0 or 1 for the correct answers, I can just simply add these as numeric values, even though we're showing text to the form submitter, and handle my calculations that way. And if we look at the conditions, you'll see there's a lot fewer than there were before. So really all I'm doing is looking for a score of greater than 1 to override the failing result with passing in the short text field where we track pass or fail for each section. And then based on the total score, I override the message that shows about passing or failing. So leaving these fields visible, right? These would run in the background and we'll look at that in just a second. But the way it functions is my form calculation widget will look for scoring. And if the values are correct, it'll go ahead and just add those together. So even though the actual value of, this question is text, the underlying calculation value is numeric, and I can go ahead and add those up. And if they're wrong, I'll just get 0 for any of those. And again, the way that would look for the form submitter is all of that logic and those calculations are being done in the background. They don't even need to know about it. They're just taking their quiz and they'll get their email with their results at the end. Cool. And I did mention that calculation values could be text-based. So I'm going to show you an example of how that could be applied as well. So this is just like a field trip request form that a teacher can submit. And I've set up a dropdown with some schools that are all very real sounding options. So the schools might show as text-based values, but uh, and school names, but I've gone ahead and set calculation values to where the underlying value for these is actually an email address. So I have all of these email addresses set up. And what I can do now is I could go ahead and copy this value to this hidden principal email field. And I'll just go ahead and unhide this real quick as an example. So if you don't know, you can quickly right click onto a field and choose to like show it or hide it, or you get a couple of other quick options without having to necessarily go all the way into the properties to do that. I also have some conditions set up to show these grade level fields. Again, all of that was covered in that first session where I went over kind of the basics of conditional logic. But if we take a look at the conditions on this form, the one that's doing most of the work is going to be this one where I'm copying the value from the select your school over to the principal email. And again, the cool part is that because I have those calculation values set, even though all I'm doing is copying the value, I'm not copying the school name. I'm copying that calculation value, which is actually an email address. So if we were to look at the functionality of the form with that field visible, when I select a school, I do get my grade level that shows because that was a hidden field and logic there. But more importantly, I get that principal email field that gets filled. And we're going to use this in an approval flow, which is why we need that principal email. And if we just take a look at it with it hidden, again, you could right click into that field if you want and just hide it. Now I can go ahead and select my school. I don't even know that that principal email field is there, so I'm not worried about it. And I can just go about completing my form. And if we look at the workflow, this is a very simple workflow, but it is dynamic in the sense that we're using that principal email. So without any type of logic in the workflow itself, I'm actually changing who the recipient is and who the approver is based off of the school being selected. And to the form submitter, they just know that they're choosing a school. They don't even know about any of the logic that's going on or the hidden fields or anything like that. So that's a quick and easy way to kind of make your workflow dynamic. So the last topic that I wanted to touch on is going to be extracting values from input tables. So input tables are a great way to collect data in a concise manner. You can have them like this, where they're set up with single choice, or you could have them a mix where maybe it's an actual hard-coded input, or you would have a drop-down with options. But in this case, I'm using a single choice. And before I get to the rest of the form, the reason I'm extracting these values is because the conditional logic around the input field is somewhat limited. And I can actually show you an example of that. Let's say I wanted to like show and hide a field based off of the value in an input table. If I go to select it, really all I get is contains, does not contain, is empty, or is filled. And in my scenario, that doesn't really help me because I have specific values I'm trying to extract and then logic that I'm trying to have happen based off of those values. So if we go back and look at the form, you'll notice, so these are visible right now. I'm going to hide them to show you what the actual experience would be, but so you can see how the logic functions, they're visible now. And what I'm doing is I set up a form calculation widget. So I can pull the value out of this input table and pull that phrasing into this widget. And the way you would do so, like if I delete this, if I just go to add a field and select the input table, I can choose the row that I want to grab the value from, and we'll do the call connection quality on this one. And then we want to change this from a numeric value to a text value. So that way we can use that string in our calculation value, in our conditional logic to look for a certain phrasing that'll show some additional fields. And what this form is, it's just a feedback form where a customer can give feedback on an interaction with a representative, essentially. So you'll notice down here on the rest of the form, I have this paragraph field. That's just always the same static text, but it's hidden. And then these long text fields that correspond with each row of the input table. And what I want to do is if they select not satisfied for any of the options in this input table, I want to copy that value into here. And then I have conditional logic that'll show the corresponding long text field and then this paragraph field. So if we look at the conditions, you can see if any of these, we'll use call connection quality, is equal to not satisfied. So this is, again, going off of the form calculation widget, not the input table. Then I want to go ahead and show that paragraph and the long text field that corresponds with it. So if we take a look at the functionality of the form with those fields visible, if I select not satisfied, I see that paragraph and I see my long text field. Same for wait time, technical knowledge, and friendliness. If I change any of these to something other than not satisfied, then I don't get those long text fields. And if I liked everything, then I don't have to provide any additional feedback at all. And again, just so you can see how you can leave those hidden. And if you don't know, you can select multiple fields at once and quickly hide them in groups instead of having to do one at a time. And if I were to refresh, I get the same type of output without having to see any of those form calculation widgets. But it allows me to then take those specific values and set conditions around it while collecting my data in an input table. So it's a nice experience for the form submitter without actually having to show all of those other fields or only set it based off of is this input table filled or not. I can actually look for specific values and make my form do what I want it to do. Cool. So as you've seen, there are many ways in which you can use conditional logic beyond the basic applications to enhance the functionality of your forms. The get form page URL widget combined with conditional logic allows you to create forms that can be completed by multiple users at different times. Calculation values allow you to have dropdowns, single choice, or multiple choice fields that show a set of text to the user, but have entirely different underlying values that can be used conditionally or in workflows to make your forms more dynamic. And as we've just seen, extracting values out of input tables through a form calculation widget unlocks an entirely different set of possibilities when combined with conditional logic. I encourage you to take what we've discussed today and apply it to your own forms to see how you can further improve their efficiency and functionality. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat or the Q&A if you haven't done so already. So just kind of looking at some questions here. If we customize the name and the sign, the name of the sign and approve step in the workflow, can that be used instead of first approver or last approver? Yeah, you can use whatever value you want as the URL parameter. It doesn't have to be first approver, last approver. You just want to make sure that the value you put in the URL of the edit link matches the same exact value that you're checking for in the condition. That way that logic will be met and those fields are show or those fields will be disabled, whatever it may be. Can you go over the clear hidden field values option again and when we should worry about it, for example? Yeah, definitely. 1 second. I think that was this form. Yeah, so that clear hidden field values. So what's that saying? What that is saying is choose whether or not to clear values for fields hidden by conditional logic. So this only applies if you're conditionally hiding a field. So in this case, I think it was this one. I'm conditionally hiding this date and contractor signature based off of this edit link and this client completion phrasing in my parameter. So what I want to do is set this to don't clear because what would happen is when I come in here and fill this out, oops, this is the edit link. Since the contractor signature and the date is now conditionally hidden, when I actually resubmit this, it's going to clear those values out if I don't change that to don't clear. Now, in a case where the field is already hidden, no matter what, like any of those examples I showed you on the quiz, or this here where I'm pulling a value with a form calculation widget, that's not using conditions to hide those fields. They're just already hidden no matter what. So you don't have to really change that value then. It's only if you're conditionally hiding it like I am on this example here. So if you're setting up a condition where you're saying hide or hide multiple, that's where you want to make sure to check that option and change that. If the field is just hidden on the builder, like say I just wanted to have this hidden and I never conditionally hide it, it's just hidden all the time, then you don't really have to worry about changing that. It's only going to be if you're conditionally hiding a field. Let's see. Michael, I see that you say you submitted a question via email, but can't send it here again if I need to. Oh, but can send it again. Yeah, if you could drop that question in here as well, that would be great. And let's see, there are some functions here that we've been waiting for. When will the video be ready so that I can go back a little bit slower pace and try them along with the side examples? Mark and I don't know if you know how long it takes to get these videos up, but I imagine it's not a very long turnaround time. Okay, yeah, I don't know what the exact turnaround time is, but I would imagine it's probably at some point today, or later tomorrow, maybe even earlier. But yeah, definitely check out the YouTube channel or the Lunch and Learn page, which I will show you the URL to if you need to see it uh, in just a second. There
Yep.
we go.
I was just going to chime in and say we should be able to have that up today, if not first thing tomorrow.
Yeah, it'll be up on our YouTube channel later today.
Awesome, perfect. All right, Michael, thank you for adding that question. We have 11 fire stations and a training center. We're trying to have a drop-down list of these locations to provide the full address for these locations on a purchase order to indicate whether or not the vendor should ship the order. Can you talk about how to make this happen? Um, so depends how you're trying to set the address. I would probably recommend submitting a ticket for this because there's a couple different ways to go about it. But the calculation values are really more one-line responses. So if you're trying to fill out an entire address field, you might want to get into using actual conditions rather than calculation values. So what I'd recommend is definitely submitting a ticket or setting up a call, with our customer success team, and we can definitely walk you through that on the call. Like I said, if you want to submit a ticket, feel free to do so. But yeah, there's a few different ways you could go about that. I'm not sure calculation values would be the best, but it is doable. And then the last one I had here were, can signatures be collected at different times using smart PDF forms? So yeah, if you're using a smart PDF form, you can collect signatures at different times and actually have them mapped to the final document. So what you would want to do, let's just say this form here was a smart PDF where I have multiple signatures. I'd want to take this contractor signature and client signature over and map both of these to the document. And then as I'm using my edit links, when the final version is done and everything is signed, conditionally send out an email, kind of like I did here, where I'm just sending out a PDF, except attach the original PDF with all of the signatures and you'll be good to go. All right. Cool. And Mark, were there any questions from the YouTube live stream?
Nothing from the YouTube live stream.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you all again for being here with me today. Our next session is on Wednesday, August 21st, and Kat will be back with a follow-up session on the Jotform Enterprise mobile app. And she'll be taking a deeper dive into a few potential use cases and additional features of the app that weren't covered on the initial session. If you have any questions that we didn't get to today, please reach out to our enterprise sales team or to our awesome customer support team if you're already an enterprise user. You can find more Lunch and Learns, webinars, walkthrough, and quick video guides on our YouTube channel and our website. And we will have some great Lunch and Learn sessions coming up that will build upon each other. So please ensure that you're registered for these sessions at jotform.com/enterprise/Lunch and Learn sessions. Appreciate you all joining, and everybody have a good day.